So much media, so little time. Who keeps track of it all? That would be me. This is Bob Andelman, and this is the Mr. Media Interview, recorded live on blogtalkradio.com on May 23, May 23rd, you may like to say, 2008. Katy Chevigny makes award-winning documentary films, such as Arctic Sun, Innocent Until Proven Guilty, Nuyorican Dream, Brother Born Again, and Outside Looking In, Transracial Adoption in America. All right, quite honestly, you may not recognize some of these titles, but if you're interested in independent film and documentaries, she's the kind of woman whose work and thoughts you'll find quite interesting. Her latest project is called Election Day. It documents the 2004 U.S. elections from 11 locations, including a Native American reservation in South Dakota and polling stations in Florida. Katy is currently in post-production on The Dishes, the story of a punk rock band that juggles family and careers in Chicago. Through her work at Arts Engine, Chevigny also oversees MediaRights.org and the Media That Matters Film Festival. We've got a lot of ground to cover, so let's get right to it. Katy, welcome to Mr. Media.
Thanks.
How are you?
Glad to be here. I'm good.
I'm delighted to be anywhere myself, but I'm delighted you could be here with me.
Good.
Let's start with your latest film, Election Day. It debuts, I think, is it July 1 or is it May 28th? Now I'm confused.
July 1 is the day that Election Day is going to be broadcast on public television on the series P.O.V.
All right, let me just correct that here.
And May 28th is the Media That Matters Film Festival.
Got it. I got that a little confused. Tell us a little bit about Election Day.
Sure. It's a portrait of one day in America, an important day, which is Election Day. I filmed it all in one day on November 2nd, 2004. We had actually a total of 14 different camera crews in towns and cities all over the country who were assigned to follow one particular individual or one polling place for the entire day, like from dawn till midnight. And I was interested to see the different experiences of people around the country as they went to cast their vote and choose the leader of the free world, as well as all their local elected officials. And we edited all that footage together into a sort of a day in the life of a critical day.
And so there were 14 crews out. Now, there were, as I recall, there are 11 stories that are actually woven into the...
That's right. 3 of them ended up on the cutting room floor.
I have to ask, what happened in the 3 that didn't happen? What didn't happen?
Well, first of all, we actually intended, we assume this is the thing when you shoot in a cinema verite style, you never know what's going to happen in front of the camera, and most of it is unusable. That's the real secret, of making documentary films. And so we intentionally shot in 14 locations thinking maybe a third or half of them would be worth using in the film. And in fact, they were more interesting than we thought, so we used as many as 11. The 3 we didn't include were Philadelphia, New Mexico, and another location in Florida. And they all had elements that were interesting, but they didn't have enough of a story to sort of win them a spot in the film. There was like a moment that was good, but it didn't sustain.
How long is the finished film?
We have a couple different versions. We had a theatrical version that played at film festivals over the course of the last year that was 82 minutes. And the one that's going to be on the air is just a few minutes shorter. It's about 74 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, I was thinking it was about 80 to 90.
Yeah.
It's hard, isn't it? 11 narratives into 1 hour.
Yeah.
Hour plus hour and a half film. Obviously, you have to cut a tremendous amount, and you really have to be in love with the storylines, don't you?
Yes, that was one of the reasons I wanted to do it. I was interested in that creative challenge of trying to include so many different characters in a sort of an ensemble piece, but an ensemble of people who don't communicate with each other. They just indirectly share in this common experience. Certainly I had to really kind of I was in love with a lot of the characters, and I also put some of the footage in because I thought it told an important part of the story of where we are now as a democracy. So those were kind of the 2 concerns. Like, is this an important fact or a piece of documentary evidence of something that's really interesting about 2004? And is this a great moment of Sometimes, like we say, is this a great moment of tape? Is this some great footage where it just leaps off the screen and you laugh or you're surprised? And so we try to integrate both of those kinds of things into the film.
Do you have a favorite storyline? I know which one I found the most interesting.
Which one's your favorite?
I really liked the Republican, the guy who was kind of monitoring the polling station, and he wasn't afraid to get in anybody's face.
Yeah.
He told the Democratic poll worker who was sitting down that wasn't allowed. He went over and shook hands with a poll worker outside the polling place, and because of the way he shook the guy's hand, the guy stepped over by like a foot the line of where he was supposed to be.
Yeah.
And the Republican told him to get back. It's just, he's a character.
Right. No, he's a lot of people's favorites. He was really an amazing character. We probably could have made a whole film just about him, Jim Fuchs. So he's definitely one of my favorites. It's just a pleasure to watch everything he does. And we had a great camera crew actually working with him, so that's partly why we could use so much of him, because the footage was so strong. There's a lot of other things I like a lot. And one of the stories that I found interesting was the international elections monitor, who was from Australia.
Australia, right.
In St. Louis. And part of what I liked about that is this was the first national election where we had monitors from other countries monitoring our U.S. elections. Typically we go abroad and look at other people's elections. So when we were scouting locations and trying to think of ideas to include in the film, one of our producers said, well, this is the first year there's going to be international monitors. And I said, oh, well, we've got to film that, because that's just the flip side of what we see footage of, monitoring other elections in other countries. And so seeing, and the location where Shanta was in St. Louis was really, there were some real egregious disparities in access. And so seeing these problems in the election system through the eyes of a foreigner, I thought was really interesting from a filmmaking standpoint, because I think you feel it differently when you see a foreigner looking at us, objectively. It's like a little more embarrassing somehow that this is what we're portraying to the outside world. So that's also one of my favorites, just the way she looks at it and the way it makes the viewer feel about what's happening in our country.
I think the other one, I was just thinking about it, I think the other one that I really like was the Palestinian gentleman who was voting for the first time. You have a lot of those type of moments, but that he made mistakes, or he made mistakes, and he takes his ballot back to someone in the polling place and says, I need to do it over again. And naturally, you go from this Palestinian man to this incredibly white bread, plain Jane. No offense, but that's the way she comes across, and she's just like looking at him like, what do you mean you made a mistake? What kind of mistake did you make? Well, I think there's only one mistake you can make, right? Yeah,
right. Yeah, no, that is a good moment. That his wife is actually running for office. His Palestinian American wife is running for office now, for a local office in Michigan. So they've gotten quite politicized as a family.
Oh, that's happened since then.
Since then, yes.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And have you kept in touch with other people from the film?
Well, we have, because we've been, keeping them abreast of what's happening with the film, and it's interesting. We had kind of hoped there'd be more changes in the voting system. There'd be more improvements over the course of the last 4 years, but Congress didn't really move the ball forward significantly over the last 4 years, unfortunately. So we thought it might be interesting to do a kind of where are we now, but not enough has changed for that. But Jim Fuchs is still working as a committeeman in the 44th Ward in Chicago, and Sheriff Young is still the sheriff in that county, and so that was, a lot of those things are moving forward. The politically involved people are continuing to be so.
Now, I think most people, when they think of documentaries, they don't think in terms of traditional narratives and characters, but Election Day, you've got characters, you've got narratives, you've got storylines. Other than the fact that it's verite, it's a story, right?
Yeah, no, thanks for pointing that out, because that is something. It's kind of interesting, people's perspectives of what documentaries are these days. I think there is particularly when there's a documentary about a quote-unquote political topic, even though I don't necessarily think Election Day is political, and it's not political in a Michael Moore kind of way, but it's about politics, so it's political and to whatever extent that's the case. But I think there's a lot of perception, I find this when I talk to people about making documentary films, that you're making a particular kind of film that's going to have a lot of talking heads, and it's sort of like an essay that sets out an argument. And we've certainly made films like that, but what I wanted to do with Election Day was try to make a film that felt more like, as we sometimes say in the production office, feels like a movie. You know, it doesn't feel like school. It's not like a textbook you're being taught something about some nonfiction subject you have to learn. But, yeah, the character is just kind of, you get captivated by what they're doing, and that's what carries you through the movie. And if you happen to learn something about election reform along the way, more power to you. But we really wanted the experience of it to be watching a story unfold.
Well, I wanted to ask you, your Election Day is going to debut on television on the PBS series P.O.V., and I'll repeat the date again. It's July 1st. But I wondered if you approached this as you were getting ready to go into production on Election Day with a particular point of view of how this was going to turn out or what to expect, and then did that change after you got to go through all the footage and start making edits? Did your view of all this change?
Yeah, that's always an interesting process when you're making, again, a cinema verite style documentary where you don't know exactly what the outcome is going to be or what your footage is going to reveal. I mean, there was a sense in which we didn't know because, A, we didn't know the outcome of the election, and we didn't know how fraught it might be at the polls in 2004. You know, if you remember when we were there was a lot of talk before the 2004 election of, like, are we going to have the debacle like we had in Florida in 2000, that kind of thing. So in a sense, we were open to that. I wasn't predicting it, but we were open for the possibility that there might be a real major problems with the election like that. In terms of things that we found out that sort of changed my perspective, I think one of the major ones was I think I had sort of just bought the line that part of the reason we have such a low voter turnout is apathy. You know, there's a lot of kind of spin around the idea of voter apathy. And that, well, you know, you'll hear pundits on TV, you know, saying, like, why is it that more Americans don't come out to vote? You know, in Western Europe, they go out to vote in high percentages, blah, blah. And what I felt after looking at the footage was we didn't have so much evidence of apathy as we did people trying to vote against incredible odds and up against, like, real barriers and problems. One of the scenes that's most effective for me when we were just watching the footage, just the raw footage, there's a scene in St. Louis, and it's a cold and rainy day, and it's a poor neighborhood, and the polls aren't working properly. And there's this really long line through the whole school and out the door, and there's an old woman standing at the end of the line, and she's cold, and her granddaughter takes her hat off her head and puts it on, and they're waiting in the line for 2 hours. And when I saw that shot, I said, how can people talk about apathy? I mean, this is the ultimate disenfranchised population. This is an older black woman in a poor neighborhood. Like, it's been a pain in the neck for her to vote her whole life, you know, for one reason or another. And here she is still out there trying to do it despite the fact that it's cold and there's no real reason she should be standing for 2 hours. And we just saw so much footage like that of people going from polling place to polling place and being like, over my dead body, am I not going to vote today, you know? And so I said, yeah, sure, there's some apathy, but I think people get discouraged and leave. That's not apathy exactly. That's like a rational decision to do something else with your day because you're feeling like what you're trying to do is being thwarted, you know? So I felt like, I think the apathy thing is a way of blaming voters for a problem that's really not entirely their problem. I felt very pro-voter after making the film. Like, we really need to help people vote who want to vote. There's a lot of them out there. A lot of them have a hard time. That kind of brought out my American pride a little bit, you know, like we should do better.
Did you come to any particular conclusions about why it's so hard to vote in certain places? Is it a racial issue? Is it, as you know, sometimes after meeting certain of our elected officials, I think it's just incompetence. But I strongly suspect race is an issue, and then there may be other issues. Yeah.
I mean, there's certainly one of the struggles of making a film like this is there's so many different reasons in different localities why people have trouble voting. And one of the reasons we kind of have trouble wrapping our brains around the problem, I think, is because you get kind of glazed over by statistics and details. And we were determined not to make that kind of a movie. one of the things we would always say as sort of a theme when we were working on the film was that the devil's in the details. And that part of the reason it's hard to wrap your brain around is because there's no single bullet theory. There's no one thing. I mean, like you suggested, there's a lot of different factors. There's this great book that I read partway through making the film that was very helpful to me in terms of thinking about framing that idea. This book called Stealing Democracy by a law professor named Spencer Overton. And he has this great analogy in his book about where he compares our electoral system to the alternate worldview that you see in the movie The Matrix, where, like, you know, everybody in The Matrix is walking around thinking that they have a system that works, and it turns out it's actually a completely different reality that they're just programmed to imagine. And he basically, in his introduction, he's like, that's what the electoral system is. Like, we cast our vote, and we think there's some simple way in which that vote is, you know, counted. But in fact, there's like a Byzantine system, some of which is corrupt, a lot of which is just plain old incompetent, all of which is underfunded, under-resourced. That's the way in which our votes are counted and the way in which people are elected. And the more you get into it, the more shocking it is, the more you learn about it. There's certain things like there's 4,600 different voting systems in the United States because it's so highly localized.
Right.
So all these different, so you can imagine there's going to be some localities that are going to design a worse voting system than somebody else. And if you happen to be in one of those towns or cities where your local officials have designed a particularly poor way of voting, then yeah, you're going to have trouble. But it's certainly, race still plays a major factor in polling places all over the country. Some comments people have said about the film, some people said to me when we were showing the rough cut around before we were done, they said, you know, Katy, you really made a film about the persistent problem of race in America, particularly in the black-white context. And I said, you know, I really didn't set out to make that film at all. I was hoping to tell a different story, but that's what the footage kept showing in location after location after location. You can see it visually. You know, there's a lot of black people in line here, and then in other places it's much easier for white people to vote for a number of different reasons in different locations, but it still falls along those lines for class reasons, lack of resources, et cetera. So it's, you know, we're not out of the woods in terms of the problems that have sort of bedeviled the system from back in Jim Crow days. Not all of those problems have been resolved.
So where were you? That sounds funny, but where were you on November 2nd, 2004, when you had 14 crews out? Were you with a crew?
Yeah.
Were you at a central command station? Where were you?
Our producers, we had a central command station here in New York that our producers were at. I was with the New York crew, which was following Leon Batts, who was a 50-year-old former felon who was voting for the first time, who just recently been reenfranchised.
Unlock the block.
Yeah, exactly, right.
Right.
So I recorded sound for that crew that day.
Oh, okay. So you were literally in the field. I mean,
yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm usually in the field on the films that we make that I'm intimately involved in. So it was just a short production schedule, though. It was just the one day.
How nerve-wracking was that day for you?
Oh, it was incredibly nerve-wracking. I mean, it was quite the the effort of trying to put together 11 crews who were all going to be filming on the same day was a stunt that was far beyond what we had ever tried to do as a production company before. I mean, it really required a network of sophistication that we hadn't had before. And that was partly why we had 14 locations, is so that if some of them didn't work out or there were problems, we would still have a movie. But I was also very excited about it because I thought, part of what inspires me as a documentary filmmaker is I thought, regardless of what happens today and regardless of what our characters do, we're going to have 100 hours of footage, which is basically what we had, documenting a historic moment in the United States. Regardless of the outcome of this election, 20, 30 years from now, knowing what actually happened on the ground for regular people on November 2nd, 2004 is going to be an interesting thing to look at. So that kind of motivated me through the unknowns. Whatever we do, we're still going to have this footage. It's going to be interesting.
I was just thinking back to Jim Fuchs and that storyline, the Republican who was watching the polls. At one point, when he's telling the Democratic guy who's sitting at the poll table that he has to leave, the guy, the Democrat, sees the camera and says, "I don't want to be on film."
Right.
And Fuchs says to him, "I don't think you have a choice." And
yep.
I'm wondering if you had working in your favor. I know that certain public places are considered public in terms of filming, And polling places like that, I mean, can anyone be filmed with or without their permission at a polling place?
We are taking the position that, yes, polls are public places. I actually showed that particular piece of footage to a colleague of mine who works at Kartemquin Films in Chicago, which is a company that put together Hoop Dreams, among other films, and they're real heroes of mine in terms of the spirit of documentary filmmaking and part of the public conversation. And so a filmmaker with 40 years experience there, Gordon Quinn, said you should leave that clip in. Polling places are public places, and moreover, what you're doing is making a film about the need for transparency in this process, in part. And so he said, I think on free speech grounds and First Amendment grounds, you have an argument to include that scene in regardless, which is partly why I left in that guy turning to the camera and saying, I don't want to be taped, was we gave him his moment to say, I'm objecting to this. We were trying to be transparent about our own presence there as well, and how it wasn't necessarily always welcome. I also kind of wanted to let the viewer know that was happening, as opposed to pretending, just the fly-on-the-wall model where it's as if you're not there. Of course we were there, and of course people noticed there were cameras, and sometimes it created tension. And I think that's part of the story too.
Did you have to get involved with, getting clearances from people, or did you not do that because of the nature of this?
No, we did get clearances from people. We didn't get clearances from every single person online, but when somebody was playing a somewhat significant role in a scene, we did get an appearance release from them.
Okay. Katy, before I forget, let me give out our phone number. Sometimes I get so involved in the interviews I forget to do that. If you'd like to call in and ask Katy a question or talk to her about one of her films, the number is 646-595-3135, and I actually think we have a call right now. Let's go and take a look. Hi, do you have a question for Katy? Hello?
Hello?
Hi, yeah, you're on. Do you have a question for Katy?
I guess nobody's there.
Yeah, we're here. Hello? Okay. Well, Katy, we try.
Okay. Yeah, maybe they'll come back.
Yeah, they actually called in twice. That's what reminded me to give out the phone number. Let's see. So what was the budget for the film, and how much, how hard was it to find the funding for this film?
It was really hard to find the funding for the film, much harder than I expected. I actually kind of thought that we'd hit a little, easy-to-fund film, that very elusive idea, which really doesn't exist, I think. The total budget of the film was around $400,000. We're actually still raising money for the educational component of the film, of getting it out to a broader audience. The bulk of the funding came from a branch of public television called the Independent Television Service. That's one of the few entities left that funds independent filmmaking. And as a result of that, it helped us to get a public television broadcast, which I'm very pleased to have. It's hard. There's not that many major network broadcast opportunities for independent documentary films that aren't commissioned by a network. So we're really happy with that.
Yeah, I imagine there's only so many slots on P.O.V, and it's good to secure for those. Let me try this call again. It keeps coming up here. We'll give them one more try.
Okay, great.
Hi, do you have a question for Katy?
Hi, yes I do. Katy,
sure.
I have a question about Election Day. Why did you want to make the film? Was it just because of interest in the subject matter, or was there some sort of artistic motivation there as well?
It was definitely both. I mean, part of it was, the summer of '04, there were just a lot of people getting involved in that election. And, whenever there's like a major kind of public event going on, we often think here, is there some way that we can contribute from a sort of independent media standpoint to contribute to this conversation about what's happening? So that was partly my way of being involved in the 2004 election, was by making this film. But I also did have these artistic considerations where, our prior film, Deadline, had told a kind of complicated historical and legal story, and we had to rely on a lot of text and talking heads to sort of do exposition about what was happening and what the background story of capital punishment was in order to tell that film. And I kind of wanted to liberate myself from having to do a lot of explaining and see if I could tell a story, as you were talking about earlier, that would be just driven by the storylines and characters of regular people in a documentary form, and in a certain way even kind of use some things that had been done in fiction film but not so much in documentary film, like the idea of a film taking place in a day. There's often in fiction films there'll be a script or something that all takes place in one day, but you don't see it very often in documentaries. And especially with the intertwining storylines, like how could we compare and contrast different stories in different parts of the country, make suggestions between places, how could we do that visually? So all of that to me was a really interesting creative challenge, which is partly what I was setting out to do.
Sure. Can we expect a sequel, Election Day 2008?
No, I'm not going to do that. It's too much work to do 2004, but hopefully, I keep hoping somebody else will do it. There's so many people with cameras. I think it's kind of a cool model.
I think you could get a great title though from this one, couldn't you? The black guy, a woman, and an aging Vietnam vet walk into a bar.
Yeah, right. Yes. Well, when you get that joke punchline, email it to me. I need that one to say to people.
All right. Did you have anything else to ask?
No, that's it. Thank you, Katy.
Thanks.
Thanks for calling. So, these days, can someone make a living? I mean, a decent living making documentary films? Or is it as I've kind of always perceived it to be a hand-to-mouth existence? Yeah,
unfortunately, it's really still a hand-to-mouth existence. I mean, it's interesting. We've been doing this for almost 11 years, our company, Arts Engine and Big Mouth Films, and documentaries have become much more popular and well-known and sort of part of pop culture over that period of time, which they didn't used to be. And as a result, some people think it is easier to make a living making documentaries. Occasionally when I meet people and I tell them I'm a documentary filmmaker, they say, well, that's great. There's all this money to be made in them now, Michael Moore, et cetera. And I'm like, no, it's not really like that. It's still just as hard, in some ways harder because of there's so much media out there. It's a very crowded field. So it's very, we're somewhere on the line between art and commerce as independent documentary filmmakers. Occasionally the marketplace dovetails nicely with the artistic and, kind of independent voice work that we're trying to do with our films, and then you manage to sell your film and get it out there, and occasionally they don't meet, and then you're really working on an art project. So that's been my experience anyway. I mean, there are certainly documentary filmmakers who have a harder time getting funding and paying the bills, and some who have it easier, but it's got a huge labor of love component to it still.
Does Michael Moore's success over the years make life easier or harder for you? Yeah,
that's an interesting question. I mean, and it's certainly something that my colleagues in documentary film, we discuss every once in a while. I mean, in some ways it makes it easier because Michael Moore has just raised the exposure and the sort of interest in documentary films, which kind of lifts all boats just to have that out there. And because he breaks so many rules and he's so bold and daring, all of that helps documentary filmmakers as well. And the only way I would say in which one could argue that maybe it's hurt documentary film is that now there's people in the industry, there's a sense like, well, maybe there could be another hit like Fahrenheit 9/11, and maybe that could be you. So sometimes people start to see dollar signs in their eyes when they hear you're making a documentary film with some kind of political angle, which doesn't necessarily help us to make films just because somebody thinks there's going to be money behind it. And the only other thing that I've sometimes seen is that Michael Moore, to certain people, now seems like the way documentaries are supposed to be made. So when you make a film that's got kind of tells a subtler story that's not quite hitting the nail on the head, like the way I see Election Day, as opposed to Michael Moore where there's a very, very clear message that he wants you to walk away with, then I think sometimes people will see these films that aren't like Michael Moore films and say, like, but wait a minute, when I think of a documentary, I think of Super Size Me, I think of a Michael Moore film where there's a guy leading me by the hand talking about what he wants to talk about, and then that's the film we see.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I wanted to ask you, actually, I mean, as a documentary filmmaker, do you see yourself out to change the world, capture it, or both?
Yeah, that's a good question. Certainly capture the world as much as we can. I mean, I do believe there's something really amazing just about documenting life as it really is, or as close to as really is as we can get. And then I also do think that documentaries and independent film in general has the capacity to change the world in both subtle and specific ways. Specifically, there are films, An Inconvenient Truth is one of them, that a lot of us filmmakers aspire to have some impact like that, where it really changes the public conversation in a significant way. And I think even when we make films that have less of a broad exposure, don't have former presidential candidates in them, we still, I think in smaller ways, we are still helping to flesh out a fuller perspective of what's happening in our world through all these specific stories, all these different kinds of truths about what's happening in our world. So that's also change. I think just sharing other views of reality.
Okay. Let me give out our phone number one more time. It's if you'd like to call in and ask Katy Chevigny a question or talk to her about one of her films or documentaries in general, the number is 646-595-3135. Now remember, that only works if you're listening to us live today, Friday, May 23rd, 2008. If you're listening as a download, I'm afraid we're probably off doing something else by now. So, Katy, you operate under a lot of different banners, the largest of which seems to be the nonprofit media organization Arts Engine. Can you explain what that is a little bit?
Sure. Arts Engine is the organization through which we do all these different projects. So Arts Engine is a nonprofit that I co-founded several years ago, and I'm currently the executive director. And Arts Engine has a mission to promote the increased impact and exposure of independent media with a special focus on social issue documentary film. So one of the projects we do is Big Mouth Films, which is where we do our long-form documentary film production, including Election Day, which is what we've been speaking about so far. So that's a major part of the work we do, and that's what I started doing. I was a documentary filmmaker before we started Arts Engine. And then there's a couple other significant web-based programs we do, which is how a lot of people know about us because it's, we get millions of visitors that way. We have a website called MediaRights.org, which is a community website for documentary filmmakers and people using documentary films for social change. And then we also run the Media That Matters Film Festival, which we're now about to launch our 8th annual festival for.
All right. And I'm going to come to that in a minute, but I'm wondering now. Big Mouth is the production arm of Arts Engine, and I guess I'm going to ask, but I'm afraid to ask. Where does the name come from?
Arts Engine, or Big Mouth? Oh yeah. It's actually I founded Arts Engine Big Mouth with Julia Pimsler, who was an old friend of mine, and it was her idea, and I loved it immediately. And it was sort of a couple different things. One was, the idea was we were going to be kind of like speaking out about what we saw in the world. So that's where the Big Mouth comes from. We're just going to open our mouths and talk. And then the other one is a little bit more subtle, which is that Julia and I we were friends in college, and people knew us as fast talkers who were talking a lot. And so she said, let's embrace the fact that people saw us as people who talked all the time, these kind of New York City fast talkers. So that was the other reason we put it in there.
I got it. Now, is she still involved?
No, we worked together for the first 5 years, and then she kind of decided that independent filmmaking was too hard for the long haul, which I completely understood. So we're still good friends, but she's gone off to a slightly more stable existence.
I see. Now, do you have, are you married? Do you have kids? Can you maintain a life while you're doing all this?
I don't. Many people do, though. I mean, I think that independent filmmaking, there's a lot of ways to do it, and if your values are around, trying to have balance in your life, you can do it. There's also people who just make work their lives, the way people do in New York and do in film. But I actually think one of the nice things about documentary film is it's not as cutthroat as other aspects of the entertainment industry. And there's a lot of people who do care about family and time to themselves, and so. But the combination of having difficulty making a living and it being a competitive environment does make it very demanding on people as well.
Well, the reality is you can always rent a family. You can rent a kid for a day and satisfy any need that you may have, and then go back to what you really want to do.
Well, yeah, if you say so.
Oh, absolutely. I dream about that all the time.
Yeah, right.
All right, so let's talk about the Media That Matters Film Festival. As you say, it's now in its 8th year. tell us a little about the history of the festival and why it's online of all places and how that works.
Sure. We started with the festival online. We talk often about how we were one of the first online film festivals because our first festival was in 2001, which you may recall was pretty early for video on the Internet. That's been, a slow time coming as Internet chronology goes. And the reason we started it back in 2001 is that we were very excited about the promise of the Internet and what it might offer independent filmmakers and how it might expand access an audience for documentary film, which is one of our major goals through all of our web projects. And the other reason we did it online is because we saw it as sort of proof of concept that if you see social issues, social change media online, you could more readily take action in your communities to make a difference because you're online. And we created these take action links where if you watch a film and it creates some sort of emotional momentum in you to try to make a difference or get more involved, we have links right there next to the film where you can find out more about the cause that you've just seen the film about. And you can also take direct action, like volunteer for an organization or sign up on a petition, things like that. So we were hoping to sort of channel that energy that can often come out of an effective film and enable people to do something right then and there about something they care about. So that's where that's something that the Internet really offers, that if you're just watching a movie in a theater, it's not as easy to do that kind of thing.
Right. Now, I've watched a couple of the films. I wasn't really sure what to expect until I started pushing, it's online. So, but I found myself immediately drawn to one called The Countdown. It was, I think the woman's name is Sophia Snow. She does a spoken word composition about 9/11. Mm-hmm. I think it's about 5.5, 6 minutes. It's really amazing how quickly you can get drawn into something that you're not expecting to have, really, a strong interest in necessarily. I think that's sometimes the magic of the documentary.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I'm glad you felt that way about that piece. She's a young filmmaker, and we try to showcase a few films by young and emerging filmmakers every year because they're usually very strong, like that one is. What's great about young filmmakers is they're not burdened by what they're supposed to do or what they feel they need to do for commercial reasons, and they often just kind of say it loud, say it proud, kind of an attitude towards what they care about, which we really thought was reflected in that film. But I'm glad to hear you were drawn in by it. Yeah, it's got, especially that spoken word style has a certain kind of mesmerizing effect, where all of a sudden you're kind of caught up by the rhythm and you're inside something else. Yeah,
it's interesting. A moment or two I was aware that it was kind of a monotone delivery. It didn't have, big rising and falling, but it just there was something about the strength of it that really kind of grabbed me.
Great.
And you know what? I'm sorry. I just realized that I inadvertently pushed the button and it started. I know you didn't hear it, but it started playing in my ear.
Oh.
What are some of the other ones that you like this year?
It's always fun here at the office because we have, a large staff, not a large staff, but we have a large group of people who are working on it. We all have our favorite films that we kick around at different times. I really love the eclectic nature of the collection, that there's, just when you're in one rhythm of one approach of one film, then you see something completely different that reminds you of how many different ways there are to talk about something that's important. Personally, I'm really fond of A Nomad's Life this year, which is a film from Tibet about basically a family of nomads in a Tibetan plateau and their sort of declining way of life. And it's pretty much in the cinema verite format. It's beautifully filmed, so that's I get transported watching that film, where I just feel like I'm halfway around the world in this other place, learning about a way of life that seems kind of magical, and I don't know anything about it. So I like that one because it's subtle, but it really does also speak to the power of documentary film to bring us to a place we couldn't go to otherwise. So that's a special one for me.
How many entries were there this year?
We always get close. In the last few years, we've gotten close to 500 submissions. So it's really quite competitive, yeah. And they come from all over the world. We don't actually do any solicitation of submissions internationally, or very little. But as sort of our reputation has grown, we get more and more films about international subject matter and from foreign countries.
Now, I had to close the window on the screen because it was starting to play the audio. How many are these finalists? Are these the winners? How do you characterize
Well, we
them?
call them the winners. Basically,
Okay.
they're that we've chosen out of 500 submissions 12 winning films, and we give the different awards different names. So one of them is the Changemaker Award, and one of them is the Youth Voice Award, etc. But we consider them 12 winners.
One of them it was called E-Waste. It was animated.
Mm-hmm.
I have to admit, it didn't grab me, although I already supported the aims of the thing. It's about fighting the exportation of old computers to China and other places where maybe they don't have quite the same standard for recycling or protecting the environment that we do. But it was odd because I'm already sold on the point, but I didn't find that the film worked for me. I don't know, That was strange.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of, I guess, what I like about the eclecticness of the collection. I mean, in the sense that one of the things about having a collection that's eclectic like this is, while at the same time there's unlikely to be somebody who likes every single of the 12 films, there's also something for everyone, so it's unlikely you're going to find somebody who doesn't get something out of one of the 12 films.
Right.
So, occasionally we have films that are a little bit more kind of rough and tumble in the way they're filmed in terms of production value, and occasionally we have people who say, I don't like to see footage that's so, amateurly shot, and then we have other people who say, I love the freshness of that young person's vision. It really got my attention, unlike a polished piece. So we try not to sort of pass judgment on those different styles. But one of the reasons we liked E-Waste and wanted to include it in the film was in the collection, wasn't just because of the topic, but because of its use of animation. So, for me, even if there's films in there that don't necessarily speak to you as an individual, sometimes I think it's still interesting to just think, okay, how effective was that as a means of getting people's attention and conveying a message using black and white animation? And so I still find it like interesting food for thought from a filmmaking and message making standpoint.
Well, let's come back to your work. You've made a number of films. Any that you're particularly proud of, and any that you wish you could go back and make changes in at this point?
Oh, that's funny. We try not to think about things we want to make changes to because it's just such torture. There's certainly little things I'd like to change in all the films, but we recently, because it's our 10-year anniversary, had a retrospective in New York at the Paley Center, which used to be the Museum of Television and Radio, and we showed all 8 of our films that we've done in the last 10 years, and several of them I hadn't seen in quite a few years because we made them in the late 90s and 2001, years like that. But I was really, I really felt on the whole proud of the work and happy to see how well they'd aged. Again, I think when it's like a true documentation of a period in time, it has value even if that time has passed. Sometimes it even gains in value. I have some hopes with Election Day that 20 or 30 years from now, when it's a historical document, really, to see what happened in 2004, it'll have a different kind of interest to people. But in response to, specifically to your question about, I actually have a real fondness for Arctic Sun, which is a film that we had, that was actually on P.O.V. last year, which is a father and son story that takes place in a native village in the Arctic Circle in the Canadian Yukon. And that's actually the film that I've had the least hands-on work on. I didn't go to the Arctic myself. I took an executive producer credit on that film as opposed to producer or director. But it was 5 or 6 years in the making. We had very little support for it financially or from broadcasters. It wasn't a film that was part of a sort of popular sensibility about how documentaries should be made. It wasn't kind of hip or something like that, or explicitly political. But all of us who were working on it thought it was really an important, beautiful story and beautifully filmed and had a real great narrative. Again, like I was saying, like it feels like a movie. And so when we finally, we just struggled to finish it. And so I feel proud of that being like true kind of we earned our independent filmmaker credentials with that film if we hadn't already, in the sense that when nobody else believes in the film and you keep believing it and you make it anyway, that's what makes you really an independent filmmaker. So I feel very proud of that effort because I think the film is amazing, and I wish other people had the faith in it we had, but I'm proud that we stuck it out and finished that film. It's on DVD, by the way.
Okay.
Available for you to watch anytime.
All right. Is that available? Would people find that like on Amazon or other places?
Yeah, the best place is actually to get it on our online store, which is artsengine.net/store. And Election Day is going to be available in about a month, too.
Okay. Now, just so you know, Mr. Media gets 10% of all, plugs that you get.
Right, no problem. Check is in the mail.
Yeah. Let's talk about your latest project, The Dishes. Now, I know it's not about the kitchen, so what is it about?
The Dishes is a band in Chicago, it's a quartet, and it's 3 women and 1 man, and it's a documentary that I shot predominantly a few years ago. And they're a punk rock band, or some people call it a post-punk band. And I was interested in following them over the course of a year or two while they kind of struggled with being a mainly women punk band in the Chicago scene. It was kind of a departure from a lot of the films we make, but I was interested in seeing what it was like for basically to tell a story of women artists trying to do something different and struggling to find a way to do it financially and balance family and that sort of milieu of the Midwest rock scene I find really fascinating. So I wanted to sort of do a portrait of that.
Interesting. Have you done a film on music before?
We've worked, in addition to the films that we call the Big Mouth films, we also work as line producers and sort of assistant producers on a number of other films. Some of that is to pay the bills, and some of that is just to work collaboratively with other filmmakers. And so in that capacity, we've worked on many music films. A film about gospel for French television, a film about jazz music for German television, a film about gypsy music around the world, which had a lot of concert footage in it. So that's something that's sort of a ripple throughout our organization in terms of people's interests.
And when will we be able to see it?
I haven't finished it yet, so I need to raise some more money to finish it. So that makes the time frame harder to put your finger on. But hopefully in the next year.
Well, do you want to put out the word now while we've got this captive audience?
Sure. Yeah.
How people can reach you to
there's certainly you can always make a tax-deductible donation to Arts Engine online, and that again that would be on our website artsengine.net. And specifically, we also have a Dishes page on MySpace where people can write in if they're interested. We have the trailer there too. But we are, that's very nice of you to say. We're always looking for support from people who care about independent film and the kind of work we're doing. So it's great to get public support when we can.
Very good. Well, Katy, I really enjoyed chatting with you today, and I appreciate your time. I hope it was a good time for you as well.
Yeah, no, it was great to get to talk about the scope of our work in such detail. So thanks a lot.
All right. Well, thanks very much for calling in.
Okay, sure. See you later.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
So you can watch Katy Chevigny's new film, Election Day, when it premieres on the PBS series P.O.V. on July 1st. And the Media That Matters Film Festival will be accessible online on May 28th at www.mediathatmattersfest.org. I'll say it again. It's all one word. www.mediathatmatters, with an S, fest, F-E-S-T.org. For dozens more celebrity and media newsmaker interviews, surf over to our main site, www.mrmedia.com, like MrMedia.com, where you can listen to my conversations with the stars and creators of Army Wives, 24, The Big Bang Theory, Pearls Before Swine, Tell Me You Love Me, and many others. You can also read full transcripts of most of these interviews. Please think about writing an online review of Mr. Media or marking Mr. Media as one of your favorites, whether you listen on Blog Talk Radio, Blueberry, Zencast, or iTunes. Thanks so much for joining us today, everybody. I really appreciate you sharing a piece of your day with Mr. Media, and I hope to talk to you again very, very soon.